My brothers and sisters, permit me to begin by stating a truth that has echoed through the corridors of human history. God does not act without warning. Before he shakes the pillars of power, he first whispers to the soul. Before thrones fall and crowns are snatched from proud heads, there is always a revelation, a vision, a divine signal sent not to the blind, but to those with eyes willing to see. And when God shows you a man removed from power, it is not merely symbolic, it is judicial. It is heaven's way of serving notice that the time of accountability has come. You see, the modern world has been deceived by the illusion of permanence. Men believe that power, once attained, is immune to moral decay. They confuse their ability to command armies, sign decrees, and gather applause with divine endorsement. But we who understand the patterns of history and the fingerprints of God know better. We know that God does not show a vision to flatter our curiosity. He shows it to awaken our responsibility. When the heavens unveil a revelation, they are not predicting, they are declaring. This is not speculation dressed in religious garb. It is a judgment sealed in the realm where time does not exist. What is seen spiritually precedes what will be seen physically. Before Pharaoh drowned, Moses already saw the rod turn to a serpent. Before Belshazzar was dethroned, the writing was already on the wall. And before Saul lost his kingship, the oil had already been poured on David. Understand this. By the time the removal is seen in the natural, the replacement has already been arranged in the spiritual. But let us go deeper. Why does God reveal before he removes? Because God is not the author of chaos, he is the architect of order. Revelation is not given to confuse, but to prepare. God shows not because he needs us to agree, but because he holds us accountable. Once you have seen, you cannot unsee. Once the trumpet has sounded in your spirit, neutrality is no longer an option. To see is to be summoned. And when I saw that man clothed in the garments of political power, surrounded by influence, yet spiritually naked, I knew that heaven had already reached a verdict. The image was not abstract, it was deliberate. I saw him not falling in the way of human struggle, but being removed almost gently, as one lifts a garment from a hanger and sets it aside. There was no violence, no noise, just an overwhelming sense of finality, a silence that screamed louder than any crowd. July 25, 2025 was not just a date, it was a courtroom, a place in time already chosen by eternity where the verdict shall be enforced. Not because of political failures, but because of spiritual rebellion. For it is one thing to fail men, it is another to provoke God. And herein lies the psychological dimension we must confront. Power, unchecked by purpose, breeds delusion. The man who believes he cannot fall has already fallen in his mind. History is full of kings, emperors, generals, and presidents who thought themselves immortal. But when the soul disconnects from the source, when ego eclipses wisdom, when ambition drowns humility, the mind becomes intoxicated. That intoxication is the prelude to destruction. Pride is not loud, it is subtle. It does not need to shout to be dangerous. It only needs to blind. Philosophically speaking, the revelation of a man's fall is a reminder of the frailty of all mortal pursuits. We chase titles, we build monuments, we speak in chambers of marble, but in the end, the question remains, did we walk with justice? Did we govern with humility? Did we fear God more than we feared public opinion? For when God shows you the end before the beginning, he is not showing off his omniscience, he is inviting you into alignment. He is asking, will you watch history happen, or will you prepare hearts for what is to come? So I speak not to predict, but to provoke. I speak not to terrify, but to testify. This is not a matter of political speculation. It is a spiritual matter wrapped in earthly garments. And if we ignore what God has shown, then we become complicit in the blindness of the age. We must learn to see beyond headlines, beyond campaigns, beyond applause. We must learn to hear what the Spirit is saying, not to churches alone, but to nations. July 25, 2025 is not simply a day on a calendar. It is a divine marker, a prophetic timestamp. It is the moment where heaven's decision will collide with earth's illusion. And when that moment comes, let it not catch us by surprise, for the vision has already been given. The trumpet has already sounded. Power, my friends, is seductive. It does not ask permission to enter the heart. It seeps in quietly, growing roots in the mind of its possessor until he believes he is invincible. And that is the great tragedy of those who rise too quickly or reign too long. They begin to confuse the silence of God for the approval of God. They mistake applause for legitimacy and longevity for immunity. But the history of civilization screams with clarity. No man, no empire, no throne is beyond divine reach. When God declares enough, even the greatest among us become as dust. You see, when a man rises by the will of God, but forgets the one who lifted him, he walks not in power, but in peril. Pride, that ancient enemy of wisdom, begins to corrode judgment. He surrounds himself with flatterers, isolates himself from truth, and begins to believe that his word is law and his position eternal. But the truth is stark. Power unmoored from purpose always collapses under its own weight. And when God removes his hand, no amount of security, propaganda, or diplomacy can delay what has already been decided in the heavenly realm. We live in a time where people mistake earthly success for spiritual favor. They look at influence and assume divine blessing. But let us be clear, success without righteousness is merely well-decorated rebellion. The fact that a man holds office does not mean he holds God's favor. The fact that he commands men does not mean he commands heaven. That is why the removal of power is often not a surprise to the spiritual. It is a confirmation. It is the visible manifestation of what has long been decreed in the invisible realm. This is the danger. When leaders become untouchable in the eyes of men, they often believe they are untouchable in the eyes of God. They construct systems to protect their image, silence dissent, and maintain control. But there is no fortress high enough to escape divine justice. No bulletproof convoy can outrun a verdict from the throne of heaven. When God removes his presence, what remains is a hollow shell still speaking, still ruling, still feared, but no longer protected. And such a man walks into judgment not knowing he has already been dismissed. The psychological dimension of this is worth deep reflection. Power creates a cognitive distortion. It breeds the illusion of self-sufficiency. The longer a man rules, the more he begins to believe he earned it. He forgets the prayers that once elevated him, the people who once trusted him, and the God who once endorsed him. That forgetfulness is the first sign of decline. He stops seeking counsel. He silences truth tellers. He becomes intoxicated with his own voice. And when this intoxication matures, it leads to isolation from God, followed by public disgrace. And so, when God reveals that a man will be removed, it is not an act of divine cruelty. It is an act of divine order. It is heaven saying, "You have trespassed long enough." It is God standing in defense of the oppressed, the voiceless, the faithful who cried behind closed doors. The removal of power is often the answer to the prayers of those whose names were never in the news, but whose knees never left the ground. They saw the arrogance, they felt the abuse, they endured the corruption, and God, in His justice, acted. This is why July 25, 2025 is not a random date. It is not political theater. It is a divine appointment. A day fixed in the calendar of heaven where judgment meets power and righteousness confronts pride. Not because man rose up, but because God stepped in. This removal shall not come through chaos, but through clarity. It will not be a coup, but a correction, and no force, no alliance, no amount of propaganda will be able to prevent it. Because when God says, vacate the throne must be vacated. Now hear me. This is not a time for celebration. It is a time for reflection, for if such a man, surrounded by security, revered by millions, could fall, then who among us is safe without humility? If God can remove one in power, then we who serve in silence must also ask, are we walking in obedience or merely in opportunity? My brothers and sisters, allow me to continue this discourse not as one who merely observes history, but as one who listens attentively to the whispers of providence moving through it. When we speak of removal, of divine judgment, of a date as specific as July 25, 2025, we must ask what lies behind it. What necessitates it? And the answer, though uncomfortable, is clear. It is the moment when secret sin meets public stripping, when the weight of hidden corruption becomes too great for the divine order to sustain in silence. It is when exposure becomes inevitable and the mask of legitimacy is torn off not by men, but by the hand of God Himself. You see, there is a dangerous theology that has taken root in our generation, one that believes as long as the crowd cheers and the economy moves, character no longer matters. That moral decay can be managed behind closed doors so long as public appearances remain intact. But I stand here today to tell you, God does not negotiate with compromise. What He tolerates for a season, He exposes in due time. The removal of power is never random. It is often the final stage in a divine process of justice long underway. The man in question, the one shown to me in the vision, was not removed abruptly. He was weighed, he was watched. He was given time, opportunity, and warning. But when sin becomes systemic, when lies become policy, when oppression becomes structure, God intervenes not just to remove, but to reveal. And this is the dangerous irony. The man believes he is falling because of his enemies, but in truth he is falling because of his choices. Enemies do not topple kings, sin does. Let us reflect deeply on the psychological dynamics at play. Power creates a fortress, not just physically, but mentally. It gives the illusion that consequences are negotiable, that as long as one controls the narrative, one controls the truth. That cameras and speeches can replace character, but reality, spiritual reality, does not operate on illusion. It waits, it observes, and when the cup of injustice is full, it pours itself out in the form of undeniable exposure. Not whispered allegations, but undeniable truth. And when that truth erupts, no spin doctor can contain it. There is a point at which God allows corruption to mature, so that it can collapse under the weight of its own filth. A point where He allows pride to go unchecked, not because He is indifferent, but because He is building a case in the court of public perception. Because when exposure finally comes, it must be undeniable, it must be surgical, and it must be final. Not to humiliate, but to restore what was broken by deception. Philosophically, we must recognize that exposure is not just punishment, it is purification. It is God saying, I will not allow this disease to spread any further. I will cut it out that the body may survive. And yes, the surgery is painful. The revelation is uncomfortable, but without it the infection grows. That is why divine exposure is always followed by opportunity for reform, for healing, for realignment. But that opportunity comes only when truth is no longer hidden. Now hear this clearly. Secret sin may be hidden from the cameras, but it is not hidden from the courtroom of heaven. There every motive is weighed, every lie is recorded, and every injustice cries out for response. And when the cries reach heaven's threshold, the earth must shake. This is not paranoia, it is principle. It is the very law by which heaven governs earth. We must ask ourselves, why does God expose publicly what was done privately? Because power is never private, leadership is never private, influence is never private. The man who rules in public while living in secret corruption deceives not only his followers but himself. And so, God exposes not to destroy, but to awaken, to remind us all that righteousness is not negotiable and truth is not optional. This is why July 25, 2025 is not just the date of a man's fall. It is the date of a nation's mirror, a moment where the veil will be torn, and what was whispered in dark corridors will be shouted from rooftops. It will be a reckoning not just for one man, but for all who enabled, defended, or ignored the decline. For silence in the face of corruption is complicity, and complicity too will be judged, but all is not lost. In every moment of divine removal, there is also the seed of restoration. When God strips, he does not leave barren. He prepares to clothe anew. But the new garment must be made of truth, not deception, of humility, not pride, of repentance, not rehearsed apologies. This is the time for the remnant to rise, for those who feared God in silence to now speak, for those who have wept in secret to now lead with wisdom.